Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 48. I'm Enigmius, and today it's all about the lights. I think that's basically all we're going to be working on for the overwhelming majority of this episode, and it's because we haven't really done a lot with lighting on the ships that we've done up to this point. But I felt that with this particular ship, it would be worthwhile to kind of focus a little bit of attention on enhancing the visual aspect of the ship just with some subtle lighting. We started on the elliptical part of the ship towards the back end with some larger kind of light panels, and I think they fit. I think they're a reasonable size. I think they scale well. But even that size of a light sort of panel or whatever, anywhere else on the ship I think would be too large. So it was a question of how large can we make it before we cross a line somewhere and it just looks awful. And I decided, rather than trying to find that line, where that line is from okay to awful, I would just kind of keep things very, very subtle. And that way I'm always on the safe side of that equation, and I don't have to think too much about it because I'm already thinking smaller than I have to in order to make everything work. And you can see this little section that we put on the underside of the ship, I put on specifically for the purpose of having this little light ring on the underside, because I couldn't really think of anywhere else on this particular part of the ship on the underside where I could put some lights that would fit with what was going on everywhere else. So it was a very quick and easy thing to add. I'm really happy with the way that it turned out. It's very subtle, but it works. When you see it on the ship, when you're moving the camera around and you see it, it adds that little bit of extra visual interest. Now, we've got a number of these sort of wings. They have the sharp kind of pointy bits on either end, and then they've got this curving leading edge. And it just so happened, the way that things just worked out, that we've got a little flat part on that leading edge. And it makes it very, very easy to attach these light blocks to the edge without having to muck about with getting everything to fit. We just have to have the match feature turned on, which I pretty much have turned on all the time anyways. Slope blocks, cube blocks, make sure that we've got the right block selected and have it oriented properly, and then you just go around the curve and the match feature takes care of everything else. You don't have to worry about scaling the blocks. It works pretty well. It's actually a very simple and easy way to draw attention to these long curves that we've built onto the ship without being too in your face. Now we got to this part here, and this pointy section on the very tip was not working for me. I had it there previously. I wanted something specifically that looked a little bit pointy and a little bit aggressive, but this is too pointy and too aggressive, and it doesn't fit with the profile that we've got for the rest of these sort of sections on the ship. So I took a little bit of time. You can see I reworked it. Nothing fancy, just instead of having that sort of concave point, we just built it out a little bit and kind of followed where I wanted to go, and it didn't take long. It wasn't difficult. And now we're back to the same thing. Make sure we've got the right light block selected, make sure it's oriented properly, and the match feature takes care of the rest. We just sort of put it in place. We've got these little pods that I sticking out, and they were originally, in my mind, they were intended to be on the same scale as the larger sort of curved pieces that we've got sticking out of the ship. And I spent a certain amount of time, and what really sort of hung me up was the fact that these are at a 45-degree angle to the ship. Everything else is perpendicular to the ship, 90 degrees. This one's 45 degrees, and it's not necessarily difficult to build things on an angle like this, especially 45 degrees, which is about as basic as it gets. But it's a little bit easier to keep things small or go really, really big. But I felt like trying to make them a little bit bigger than they are, they didn't seem to work. They didn't seem to scale with what was going on with the rest of the ship. And making them even smaller than they are, or removing them, would have left a part of the ship that just didn't look like it was being utilized. It was one of those weird sort of balance things. So I decided to just kind of go with what I got here, understanding when it comes to adding the lighting and things like that, that they're a little bit different from the other pieces that are sticking out of the ship. So not necessarily feeling obligated to make them the same. We just kind of added the light to the edges. Same thing as before. We still had the flat section that made it easier. than it could have been, definitely. And then we get to this large part. And I saved this part to the end because this is where I plan on doing a little bit more than just the leading edge. You can see we're starting on the leading edge, same exact process. It's very quick and easy. As we get towards the front section here, we encountered some parts where I had made some concessions in building out the curve because just the way that everything came together, it wasn't as straightforward as it was in other parts of the curve. So when we kind of start filling things in and we get to this spot, it takes a little bit longer, not a lot, but a little bit longer to fill things in and kind of make sure that everything comes together the way that I wanted it to, especially at this sort of front end. I've since learned to just turn the bloom off in the graphics settings, and we don't have to worry about this blinding glow off of the lights. But one of the things that I decided to try that you'll see when we start working on some of the other details on these wings was to build the blocks, build the details out of things that are not light blocks, and then once they're done, go back and change them, because there's the feature that you can change one block for another fairly quickly and easily. And I decided to try that. And the reason why it took me this long to finally decide ultimately to turn off the bloom effect is because I don't like turning off graphics effects that can make the game look better in certain circumstances. Even if there are certain consequences to that particular approach, it just feels like turning off a beneficial feature because something is being done wrong somewhere else. It's always not my favorite kind of decision to make. But in the end, I realized that when you're actually in the ship flying around, you're so far away from the ship, even if you're zoomed in, unless you're like zoomed in to the point where you're practically inside the ship, the bloom doesn't kick in off the lights anyways. It's off. There's no bloom to be seen. So I wasn't really losing anything in this particular situation, because when it comes to flying around and fighting and, dodging obstacles in space and all that, I'm always quite a ways away from the ship with the camera. The bloom is not a contributor to the visual effect at that point, and that just means that it's all it really is a pain in the ass. So that was ultimately the decision-making process. If that changes, I'll still probably leave it turned off. What I would love to see is have the bloom turned off when you're in the process, when you're in build mode, and then turn it back on when you leave, because you can turn it on and off with the video settings in the game without leaving the game and loading back up. They should be able to turn it off when you go into building mode. Do it for you. Why do I have to go back in and out of the menus? Anyways, that having been said, just filling time, waiting for me to finish off these edges so that we can move on to the next section. Like I said, these are quite a bit larger, these pieces that we're working on now, the wings, so to speak. They're a fair bit larger than anything else on the ship, except for maybe the main hull itself. And I kind of decided before I even started making concrete plans for the detailing that I wanted more than just lighting on the edges. There's got to be something more. They're very, very flat, which makes them, in one case, they're a little bit easier to build on than some of the curved sections. You don't have to worry about getting all the gaps filled in. It's very, very easy. But at the same time, it can be a little bit difficult lining things up to place them, just because the way the game wants to move things. You can turn off the match feature to make it a little bit easier to position manually, but it's still not where I would like it to be. So you'll find that I use a lot of blocks as spacers to help me line everything up. And that's not necessarily anything new, but it's just one of the features that I think could use a little bit of continued work, shall we say. So this is the part where we start adding the extra bits, and I'm just kind of getting a little bit of spacing in place now to help me get everything started exactly where I want it to. And this is going to be the example of building it with the regular hull blocks, or in this case the armored blocks, and then switching them to the light blocks after the fact. I'm not necessarily saying it's the best way to do things. Like I said, ultimately it didn't save me from having to turn the bloom off, but it was effective in allowing me to work and place things and do what I wanted to do before having to deal with the bloom. So you can see we've got the beginning of three sort of lines. And the whole idea here is to have sort of like a ripple effect, if you're looking at it, so that the line closest to the ship will be relatively short, and then the next one will be a little bit longer, and the one after that will be a little bit longer, and all three of them will have a very similar curve to one another, which will also be very similar to the line on the outer edge, that leading edge that's currently lit. And it's not a difficult shape to work out. Getting it to line up with the curves, getting this scale right, getting everything, all of the lines the right length, it takes a little while of just sort of trial and error and kind of try something and maybe it's not quite right. It's small enough, it's very, very easy to rework and just kind of muck about with it a little bit until we get it to the point where we're happy with it. This would be the beginning of the process of the detailing on the wings. There's still some things that I would like to do. Nothing 100% concrete in my mind just yet, but it kind of illustrates this idea of adding additional elements that are there strictly for cosmetic purposes. I wouldn't even call them additional defensive elements because we are adding mass. Theoretically, if somebody wanted to destroy the wings, they would have to potentially break through some of these line segments as well. But we know that to say that this is adding significantly or even marginally to the defense of the ship would be, I think, kind of disingenuous. It's basically BS. It's not doing that much in the grand scheme of things. You can see here, this second line, the one that's supposed to be the medium length, wound up being a little bit thinner, but the same length as the outer part, and that wasn't what I was going for. So we just remove it, scale things down a little bit, get it a little bit shorter. Once everything is sort of... The key here is I'm looking at the curves and how the curves are lining up with one another, and that's how I sort of ended up with something that was too long. I was looking at the curve first and the length after, and when we got to that point, the curve worked, but the length didn't. So we got that sorted out. It's a little bit shorter now. Not a lot, but just a little bit. And then we've got this section here that's already turning out too long again. It's, again, looking at the curve and sometimes trying to match the curve. The longer it is, the easier it is to make the curve look viable. It'll make the curve look like a curve and not a segment of lines. So I think that was part of the difficulty, was just sort of getting everything to the appropriate scale as well as the appropriate shape, following the curve the way that we wanted it to. Once we get all of these sort of sorted, it's so much easier working with them like this because they're not lit, they're not glowing, and the glow doesn't overlap to parts that you're not even really working on. So it's much quicker and easier to do it this way than it is with the bloom effect on and the building with the light blocks themselves. And this is probably, I mean, I'll see when I do a little bit more lighting with the bloom effect turned off, but I can see potentially still using this method of doing more intricate lit patterns just because it makes it so much easier to see what's going on. It's to the point now, because of the detail that we've got built into the ship, the number of blocks, if I start off and I immediately load into the game and I immediately delete some blocks, it's pretty much instant. You don't even see the red checker pattern to show where the blocks you just removed are gone. But after about an hour of building, I was doing some work on the back end of the ship just after I finished recording this section here, and I erased a bunch of blocks, and I got up to get something to drink, and I came back and the red checker pattern was still there, as was the red checker pattern from a bunch of blocks that I had deleted 15 minutes prior. So the game is having a hard time keeping up, but this is what it looks like when we get those little ripple curved blocks switched over to the light blocks. It's that's basically what I was looking for. It's kind of in the middle of that long curve. It's not necessarily oriented with respect to the ship, it's oriented with respect to the curve on that outer edge. And I think that's the kind of detail that I'm looking for. It's very subtle, it's not too in your face, but it's there. And one of the things that I did, you may have noticed, was for that particular part of the build, I turned on I think it's the Y mirroring. I can never sort out the Y or Z. It depends on what kind of software you're using, whether it's a Y or Z axis, the top to bottom kind of thing. Whatever it was, I set the mirror so that whatever I was doing on the top of the wing was also happening on the underside of the wing and also happening on the wing across the x-axis as well. So we were working in 4 parts simultaneously on the wing. I really like the way that the mirror system allows you in certain cases to do that. It would be it's very rare that I'm in a position where that sort of thing works to such an extent. There are probably times when I could use the mirror feature to save myself a little bit of time, but they're so infrequent that I'm not in the habit of thinking along those lines, so I miss out on the opportunity. But in this case, I managed to take advantage of it. Definitely saved quite a lot of time. I mean, if I were to try and build those light strips on the top of the wings and then go to the underside and build them as well, they probably would never line up. They would be very, very different whether I wanted them to be or not. So we've got those more or less taken care of, and I decided that I wanted to have some light strips on the outside of this ellipse as well. We've got the larger panels on the front and the back, but you can see here very, very quickly we just switched it over to from the armor blocks to the light blocks, just little strips to kind of accentuate what's going on when you're looking at from different directions, in line with the panels that are already there. And this part here wound up taking longer than I expected on account of the slope and the offset that we were working with the light strips, but we'll get it taken care of. So I can tell you now, I've been spending a fair bit of time getting the equipment loaded into the ship. There's some more cosmetic details I want to put in place. I was hoping that we'd be able to have all the cosmetic stuff done at the end of this episode, but it just took a little bit longer. The painting also took a very long time. You may have noticed the top 2/3 of the ship now are black. So in the next episode, we're going to finish off the cosmetic details. We're going to talk a little bit about the basic ship performance. I would like to do a bit of a shakedown and at least talk about some of the things that are working and not working. And then the episode following will be the final shakedown and the blueprint reveal. So we're making good progress towards the finish. If you want to be notified about the next and future videos and this and other series, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.